Hello class, today we will be speaking briefly about federalism, and I will also then segue and speak a little bit about Congress. And we need to remember first of all that federalism is a system of division of power between the national and state levels of government. So you have a national government there. Beneath that you have the state government. And states have chartered powers to create counties, to create local jurisdictions like your cities and suburban areas. So national governments have the express or enumerated powers in the Constitution. So those are the powers that are specifically written in the Constitution. National governments also have implied powers, which they derive by virtue of the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause. State governments, on the other hand, derive their powers by virtue of the 10th Amendment. State governments derive their power by virtue of the 10th Amendment, and this gives them the reserved powers. National government powers include the powers to conduct foreign policy, the powers to coin money, the powers to conduct foreign policy, provide for national defense. State powers include powers of zoning within cities and state jurisdictions, policing, and powers around education. In a federal system, there are at least two levels of government that make decisions independent of each other. This is the federal and the state government systems. The single most cause of distension between the states and national governments derives from federalism. Usually the tension is on whether the national government has the right to impose a rule on states or whether it is states that should decide. So I had put up some clips on immigration. That's one of those areas which highlights some of these tensions, where it's not very clear exactly whose purview immigration policy will be within. Constitutionally, that's usually reserved for the federal government because it involves interaction with a foreign country. In the case of the United States, this would either be Mexico or Canada. However, there are some border states like New Mexico, Arizona, Texas that argue that on the northern border, Michigan, Washington, Wisconsin, that would argue that they should have some form of regulation of their state territories because they are bordered by foreign countries. So this creates a usual tension between the federal and the state governments. Devolution is this idea of handing power back to the states through fiscal policy. In other words, allowing states to manage finances and funding at the state level because states have a better understanding of local state conditions and priorities. Okay. State-run programs include welfare programs, interstate highway system programs, urban renewal programs, particularly in cities and suburban areas, the National Guard, the State National Guard, and so on. So there's always been an inherent debate about the powers and benefits of federalism. Some argue that federalism is a good thing. Others argue that unitary systems in which government is centralized is a better system of government. So both systems have both benefits and disadvantages. For federalism, particularly in the case of the United States, we have power divided between the national government in Washington, D.C. and 50 states. So state policy, for example, in the case of New York, is centralized around Albany, which is our state capital, where the governor of New York State lives. However, New York state policy is also affected by federal policy, which comes from Washington, D.C., led by Donald Trump. So sometimes there's tensions in terms of state policy driven by the governor and federal policy, which is run from Washington, D.C. Under a unitary system, for example, what we have in China, if that model was copied into the United States, Washington, D.C. would make the decisions for the whole country. So we would not have states, and the national government in Washington, D.C. would determine what the priorities for the whole country would be. States would not have their 10th Amendment rights. States would not be persons in and of themselves by virtue of the 10th Amendment. So a lot of power would be centralized around Washington, D.C. within a unitary system. But in the United States, we have a federal system. The Elastic Clause, this is a part of our Constitution, also called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And the Elastic Clause provides that Congress can make any laws that are necessary and proper to carry out their given duties. It is also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. And the default to this Elastic Clause goes back to what we had talked about last week. Some of the challenges that were created with the Articles of Confederation, right? And the resultant Shays Rebellion, which hastened the process of having a unitary government. Part of the challenge with the Articles of Confederation was there was no overriding national government that could regulate the states and collect taxes to protect the whole union or the whole country. The idea behind the Elastic Clause, which is also called the Necessary and Proper Clause, is it allows for Congress to do what we call conduct interstate commerce. In that way, Congress is able to tax commerce and trade between, for example, New York and New Jersey, or Delaware and Florida, or California and Washington State, or Idaho and Connecticut. And that way, the revenue that's accumulated from all these states is then handed back to the states, either in the form of block grants or categorical grants for states to use for their own advancement. Please look through some of the Supreme Court cases on state sovereignty and what those entailed. And federal-state relations can be tied to several issues. One of the ways we look at state-federal relations is in what we call fiscal federalism. In other words, how is the money for the whole country divided back and given back to the states? And this is done in several ways through grants and aid. In other words, the federal government collects all this revenue, and this revenue is handed back to the states in grants and aid, and those could be land grants, cash grants. But we also have grants in aid, which we call the categorical grants. And these are grants from the federal government that are very specific. They have to be used for the purpose the federal government says they have to be used. They're categorical grants. This is tax money the federal government generates from all the 50 states. It hands them back, this money back to the states. The states have to use this money the way the federal government says the money has to be used. Block grants, on the other hand, are the complete opposite. They allow for states to be able to do whatever they would like with the money based on the priorities at the state level. Devolution, as I'd mentioned earlier, is this process through which we allow the states to have more power over how their money or their spending priorities will be conducted. I'm now briefly going to talk about the powers of Congress, which is our legislative arm. We have three arms of government, which is the executive arm, which is the presidency, the legislative arm, which is Congress. The legislative arm, which is Congress, is divided into two parts, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 members, 2 for each state. So 2 senators for 50 states would make 100 senators. The House of Representatives has 435 members, and the distribution of seats in the House of Representatives is based on population. The distribution of seats in the Senate is based on an equal share, meaning each state gets 2 senators in Congress. The powers of Congress reside within Article 1 of our Constitution. The powers of the presidency, which is what we also call the executive, are in Article 2. And the powers of the legislative arm, which is what we call our Supreme Court in the context of the United States, or the judiciary, are in Article 3. Congress's express powers: power to tax, power to borrow, power to regulate trade. This is what I was talking about earlier, via the necessary and proper clause, or the elastic clause, to trade interstate, to tax interstate commerce, and also what we call coinage functions, the power to print currency and make coins. So this way we have, in the context of the United States, one federal government printing money or coin notes for all 50 states. So each state is not printing its own separate color dollar bill. You have one currency for all 50 states. Other express powers: powers to conduct foreign relations, war powers, naturalization powers to grant people citizenship, powers to regulate our post offices, and in terms of weights and measures would be regulating weighing machines, gas pumps, and items like that. Implied powers are those powers that are not specifically written down. They are broadly interpreted via the necessary and proper clause. This clause, as I had mentioned earlier, is also called the elastic clause. And these are the powers that Congress needs in order to conduct its business. Examples of implied powers: establishing the Federal Reserve. And if you read within your notes, this was established through the court precedent of McCulloch v. Maryland, in that process of having the federal government establish banks within the states to generate and raise revenue. So a few differences between express and implied powers. Express powers are listed in the Constitution, items like power to tax, power to borrow, power to print currency. Implied powers are not specifically listed in the Constitution. They are needed in order to have the express powers. They are needed in order to have this necessary and proper functions for government to be able to run. And they include the power to establish the Federal Reserve, draft for the army, fixed minimum wage and maximum work hours, and so on. So in conclusion, we also have some non-legislative powers, and these are the powers of not having to do with lawmaking. These relate to constitutional amendments, the electoral college, impeachment process, which are functions under Congress, and the power to investigate, to hold hearings. So non-legislative powers of Congress, again, which is our legislative arm, the power to hold investigative hearings. So Congress can investigate whether it's scandals or money that's been misappropriated, or high crimes and misdemeanors. For example, earlier in the year, we had Donald Trump's impeachment hearings. Congress investigates. Issues of impeachment of the president, issues of constitutional amendments, the 3/4 majority which would be required in our Congress in Washington, D.C., but also in 3/4 of our state legislatures. So again, thank you so much for your effort in the class. Please remember to keep up with the readings. Feel free to email me should you have any questions. I will be glad to get back with you within a 24 to 48 hour turnaround time. And please stay safe and healthy.